Well, last financial year, the government let in a record number of immigrants, more than 500,000.
The immigration issue has become a symbol of the cost of living pressure.
Australia is a beautiful country, but it is a country in decline. Life is getting harder in Australia, and it's for one reason and one reason only.
The Reserve Bank of Australia has finally admitted that these record levels of immigration are actually wreaking havoc.
The influence of think tanks, consultancy firms, and lobbyists in the UK has been made very evident by the numerous investigations on the topic. What hasn't been covered though is how the institutional power and moneyed interest over in the UK has bled through here to Australia, and how they're trying to propagandize to younger generations, specifically Gen Z. For the past while, they've been trying to convince you that they're the ones going against the grain, that their ideas are persecuted, that they're anti-establishment. The faux populism is only that though, a facade. These people and their organizations in reality are representatives of a particularly malicious and hateful wing of the ruling class. They take advantage of popular discontent due to the precarious, polycrisis-ridden situation we find ourselves in. Their views are not evidence-based, their arguments are crafted and advertised solely to cultivate attitudes which directly benefit that section of the ruling class that they represent. The big sticking point right now is, of course, immigration. Immigrants are probably some of the biggest scapegoats for the world's problems in all of history. Time after time, immigrants are blamed. Today is no different. Australia's housing crisis and general strain on services and infrastructure is blamed mostly or entirely on immigrants. The argument is very simple and very effective. We in Australia don't have enough to accommodate the amount of new people. The supply is outstripped by the demand. In the last year, 162,200 homes were approved compared to the 737,000 people coming into Australia. The strength of these propagandists is their ability to convolute basic statistics and contort them to their narrative. When you think about it and actually contextualize the data though, that narrative falls apart. Between June 2022 and June 2023, there were 215,626 homes that were built. In the same time frame, the number of households went from 10,148,600 to 10,436,000, or a 287,400 increase. So yes, in 2023, there were more households forming than houses being built, but the difference isn't as large as maybe some would like to portray. Furthermore, and crucially, if we look back to 2020, we can see that actually we have completed more homes than households forming. 572,582 dwellings were completed compared to 504,009 households that formed. Going back further to 2005, we've built 3.1 million dwellings compared to forming 2.8 million households. So if we look long term instead of pinching stats to suit a narrative, we can see that immigrant-induced population growth isn't as apocalyptic as it is often framed. Moreover, another reason why there's such a discrepancy between households and migration rates is because the majority of migrants, 283,000 of them, were international students. Now, international students, like many other students, live in student accommodation, which is not counted in the household statistics, and the ones that do rent often live in group households. Even if each individual international student in the private rental market were counted as a household, they comprise between 21.5 and 22.9% of renters. Furthermore, it is fitting to the narrative to use the 737,000 people number, as it doesn't account for departures. On net, population growth due to migration increased by 518,000 between 2022 and 2023. Okay, so it's not as dire as some suggest, but clearly migration has dramatically increased since the lockdowns, and surely that puts severe strain on the housing market, right? Well, I could go through it all, but economists that are far smarter than you or I have actually done the research on the relationship between house prices and migration, and what they find is that a 1% growth in population due to immigration leads to a 0.9 percentage point increase in house prices. When the economists applied the model to previous years, they found that if there had been no migration in 2006, 2011, and 2016, prices would have been 1.1 percentage points lower. If we apply that model to 2023 and use that misrepresented 737,000 statistic, house prices would have been 2.43 percentage points lower than what it was. Now, that's not nothing, but as was said before, this is where the propagandists contort reality. They contort that not nothing but still minor role and make it the whole deal. After all, house prices grew by 8.1% in 2023. Think of it like cake icing. It's more appealing to look at, it's very surface level, but it'd be wrong to say the icing is most, if not the whole cake. Similar is true for rents, by the way. Different economists found that a 1% increase in population due to immigration led to a 0.7% increase in rents, or in our case, 1.89 percentage points out of the 8.3% growth in rents, which again is not statistically insignificant, but not the peril it's made out to be. Now, you might say that these models can't be reasonably extrapolated to explain current prices, yet the point of these models is to extrapolate. The authors of the first study extrapolated the model over 10 years between 2006 and 2016. The same model has been used in the literature broadly in other countries in other time periods and has mostly yielded similar results. Given that you contextualize the data a bit and look at the empirical research done into the matter, you can clearly see that immigration has a measurable yet minimal role in price growth in the housing and rental market. When you actually look into the long-run causes of the decade-spanning high house price growth in Australia, the literature suggests that financial deregulation, which includes the abolition of exchange and interest rate controls, the relaxation on the stock exchange and securities industry, and the privatization of national banks combined with the introduction of a ton of foreign investment is what has spurred and underpinned the housing crisis that's been ever present for over 3 decades. So all stresses such as migration operate under that framework. For example, the money the RBA created was given entirely to private banks to park in their exchange settlement accounts, which they then tentatively lent out to large corporations and property investors. Obviously, that disproportionately benefited those with a lot of assets and property investments, which are predominantly the wealthy. All of what's represented in the literature is swept under the rug by out-of-context misconstrued statistics like this.
And yet they're still bringing in like hundreds of thousands of migrants a year. This is just pushing people into homelessness. It's pushing rental prices up. It's an absolute tragedy.
It shocked me to find out that this guy has a background in advertising and not economics. There is one economist that these propagandists love to wheel out though, Leith van Osselen. Leith previously worked as an advisor to Liberal Party Treasurer Peter Costello, specifically working on the government's financial regulation policy, the thing that spurred high price growth. Despite his credentials, Leith pretty much does the exact same thing the more popular marketers do, posts some shoddy graphs, and never actually engages in any research. I wonder why Leith will report on the ANU and RBA governor making unfounded, unempirical statements, yet won't report on what the relevant literature and empirical investigations say. And unfortunately, this is the best it's just basic economics and migration is the root of all problems crowds have. People in this country are rightfully on edge. The cost of living, particularly in the last few years, has been harsh on everyone. Many people have genuine concerns about whether we can accommodate the amount of new people that are coming into the country, and those are fair concerns to have. What should happen though is evidence-based reporting that contextualizes the stats we're seeing, not predatory out-of-context propagandizing and marketing which distracts from the actual problems in our housing market. Anyway, we already know Leith is a representative of a particularly conservative and investor-savvy part of the ruling class, but the more popular propagandists seem to also have a lot of money and institutional backing behind them as well. For nearly a year now, 29-year-old Jordan Henry Knight has been posting under his Migration Watch Australia social media accounts, primarily gaining traction on TikTok. There he mainly espouses the 737,000 figure and, not very charismatically, tries to relate it to the housing crisis.
If you disagree, brother.
Good luck. Alright, well.
Cheers.
He's very obviously named the organisation and taken after Migration Watch UK, a much more long-standing British lobby group. Migration Watch UK is headed by some very interesting people. Co-founder David Coleman was the special advisor to former Conservative ministers Liam Britton and William Waldegrave. Chairman Andrew Green was one of the Conservatives' favourite diplomats and close friend of former Minister Jonathan Aitken. What's interesting about Coleman in particular, however, is that he is a member of the Galton Institute, formerly known as the Eugenics Society. And not just any eugenics society, the Eugenics Society. They coined the term. Now, Migration Watch UK is a client of Quilla, a big consultancy firm that kind of acts like a networking proxy for Migration Watch, and it previously used to connect it with ministers and government departments. This is where it gets a bit murky though. These are all associations. I'm not saying this is a link, we're just poking around. I'm not saying there's a shadowy network that plants these people, rather I'm just pointing out associations and potential areas for future investigation and interest. Stephen Parkinson, who was a former Quilla lobbyist, worked as political director for Conservative Prime Minister Theresa May, at the same time Katie Perrier was, who worked as May's head of communications. Perrier in this article details their relationship with Stephen Parkinson. Both are a part of the Conservative Research Department as well. Today, Perrier is the chair of Totally Independent Tories in Comms, the parent company of Do Different UK, which has a single employee. And you'd never guess whose Twitter oomphies with the supposedly neutral and incredibly small niche Do Different UK, Jordan Knight from Migration Watch AU. Now, is it a massive big coincidence that Jordan follows this random UK consultancy firm with a single employee that has ties to some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the UK? It sure could be, though I'd be interested as to who Jordan previously advertised for, how he landed jobs in both New South Wales One Nation and in federal New Zealand First, maybe some experience in communication. Maybe Jordan should explain his relationship with former Sky News and GB journalist Anna McGovern, who also used to work for UK Conservative-linked consultancy firm Chelgate, was the president of her Conservative Party branch at uni, and heads the Aussie Wire, a program Jordan has appeared on. Maybe Jordan should explain his relationship with Corbyn Jennings, a senior advisor to a New South Wales Liberal Party politician, or his mate Justin McGovern, who was Liberal Party MP Michaela Cash's chief of staff. What's also funny is that when you read Jordan's articles, what comes up at the bottom is his usual affiliations and he's the director of the National Conservative Institute for Australia. When you look up this institute, nothing comes up except for its registry on open corporates. Jordan runs this phantom institute with this guy called Dan Ryan. Here's his Twitter, by the way, and look.
I was in the UK last year at that Alliance for Responsible Citizenship forum and had a quick chat with Miriam Cates. And she asked me directly, like, hey, Dan, what's going on with national conservatism in Australia?
Sorry to ruin your launch, guys. Dan Ryan helps run the Australia Institute for Progress, which in 2020 had its appeal to donate to political parties in Queensland rejected by the Supreme Court due to its ties with property developers. Might have something to do with the fact that its chairman is a property developer. So when Jordan says stuff like,
Mass immigration hurts Australians or helps big capital,
he's covering for his wealthy, well-connected partisan mates who actually benefit from people being distracted by the migrant scapegoat while they profiteer the f*** out of our society. Speaking of, what is Jordan's income? Well, he said he used to work in advertising, but what does he do now? He says living in Sydney takes up an inordinate amount of his income and that he can only afford a $750,000 house in Brisbane, which requires a bit more than the average 20 grand savings of a 30 to 49-year-old. You gotta be earning a decent amount to be willing to pay $500 for someone you won't debate to dox themselves. Yes, by the way, he refused to have a discussion about migration with me because I'm anonymous, and he got so fed up that he offered to pay me $500 to make myself put out my full name and social media. Maybe that One Nation, independent staffer money is really good. Now look, if you're good with your finances, or you're lucky enough that your parents helped you out a bit, or you're good at a job, that's not a bad thing. I don't have a problem with that. The problem is masquerading as a warrior for the poor and downtrodden in society while being in this web of institutional power and money and using that influence to distract people from the actual problems we face. It's a reflection of his class disposition and who he actually represents. Speaking of rich parents. In October of 2007, Executive Director of the real estate development company P. Anthony Lennon moved to a $6.7 million mansion in one of the wealthiest suburbs in Victoria, Toorak, with his then wife and children of 4. Anthony's dad, Tony, was the one that actually got Pete running, along the way becoming director of the Real Estate Institute for WA, doing cool and normal things such as lobbying the West Australian government to end the moratorium on evictions and rent hikes during COVID. While Australia has undergone a housing affordability crisis for decades now, the Lennons earned hundreds of millions off the back of incessant price growth that's driven said unaffordability. Anyway, sitting in that $6.7 million mansion in 2007 was 3-year-old Hugo Lennon, who would later go on to attend and graduate one of the most prestigious schools in the state, Scott College. While at Scotch, Hugo made a YouTube account posting his sick Fortnite clips and, like every second private school kid, posted edgy shit on his Discord server.
Hi, how are you? I'm a Muslim.
Let's see you sit on the knee on him.
Base? Are the most disgusting parasites the world has ever known. They're literally the worst thing that has ever happened to humanity. Name an evil. Name any evil thing you can think of right now, and I will explain to you why it's the Jews' fault.
Now look, he was 17, 18. It'll be kind of fine if he grew out of that phase, right? Hugo engages in what's called esoteric Nazism, which presents Nazi ideology, iconography, and canon in a really weird and brain-rotty way, where you have just enough plausible deniability for it to just be a joke. Regardless if he means it or not, he's obviously cultivated that kind of audience, he uses those kind of audios, and he's aware of it.
What I genuinely thought for a little while was that there was like a coordinated effort to paint me as one through the comment section. Because when what's his name,
Monuments.
misinformation.
Yeah.
When he pointed it out, I was like, that's weird that these comments came out of nowhere and now people are using them to paint me as one. So my own little conspiracy was that these are like old accounts making these comments so that it could like further push the narrative that this is Nazi content.
Well, no, because Monuments and I talked about it before he made that video. So those were already your top comments.
Yeah, it's pretty fucked.
We know that he works or worked for Amazon Web Services, that he's just started working at the Australian Signals Directorate, and we, allegedly, know from people who worked with him and around him that he's not only an arsehole, but shockingly, a racist arsehole. To my knowledge, people have even complained about Hugo's behaviour to Amazon Web Services. So, balls in your court. But look, the explicit esoteric aside, kind of, Hugo's primary serious political content is entirely focused on race and migration politics. It's always vague gestures at nationalism. It's the same bullshit Jordan pulls up. Hey, look, it's a migration watch link. I wonder why that's there. Now we can go through one by one and debunk all the claims Hugo makes, but I'd rather hear how the guy himself feels about it.
So I'm obviously very extreme in the idea that I'm trying to really paint immigration as one of the key driving forces. Whereas yourself, you're probably a lot more realistic in saying that it's a combination and a layer of policy which favors an ever increasing and ever growing property value.
This was said before Hugo said he was too scared to actually engage on the topic of immigration and then threatened to sue me after I put the audio out. So the guy whose family's wealth is entirely predicated upon the last 30 years of growing housing unaffordability in Australia, where the money for his nice little trust fund comes from, is intentionally trying to be extreme and paint immigration as the key driving force of high housing prices, as opposed to the more realistic viewpoint of the market favouring ever-increasing and ever-growing property values, which again is the source of his family's multi-millions. I mean, how much more do you want? These people are self-admitted fickle propagandists who cultivate and revel in racially charged attitudes towards migrants and use the decades-long housing affordability problem in Australia as pretense for those attitudes. There seems to be this ecosystem of young far-right people who are astroturfed and potentially influence the opinions of thousands. The main promulgators and the ones spearheading this surge, the two we've examined here, are the friends and family of the wealthy, the well-connected and the political elite, the ones who are actually driving and benefiting from this housing crisis. A full list of all known and observable connections will be sourced in the description, but suffice to say it is extensive. If you have concerns about migration, about housing, about the cost of living, good, have those concerns. These are worthwhile considerations and debates to have. Yet the disinformation spread, in my opinion, intentionally by these friends and representatives of the ruling class is deliberately designed to capture those considerations and debates and reframe the conversation around the complete red herring that is mass migration.